to everyone, and look at this beautiful day we have here in Durban today. Just an absolute scorcher, typical Durban weather. Hope you're well wherever you are, wherever you're listening from or watching from. We're busy walking through the book of Exodus. We're taking our time in this, and today we are talking about the rest of the laws given at Mount Sinai. Now, unfortunately, we can't do all of these in detail. I'm sure there are a lot of information available on a detailed analysis of all the laws and so on. But here we're just really basically doing some summaries, working through some of the most important ones or just the ones that we feel need a bit of attention. So last week we discussed the arrival at Sinai. One of the things that I've realized about the Sinai experience is it wasn't much outside the ancient concept of what happened in other ancient cultures. Laws were given by gods. The belief that thunder, lightning, cloud, fire, all of that was the acts of the gods. And really the point is that here at Sinai, we see a very typical Iron Age idea of what gods are and what they do. Particularly, it is important because we've realized, and there seems to be pretty much consensus amongst critical scholars about this issue, that the book of Exodus is not written in the Bronze Age or the late Bronze Age in the 1300 BC, but that it's written much later. It's written by elite Israelites of around the 7th to 6th century. And this final form that we now more or less have in our library of books, our Bible, was obviously influenced by the time between these supposed events and the actual final writing down of the events. If we're talking about more or less 600 years or so, that's a long time for ideas to develop. And one thing we'll find, and I'm more and more realizing, is a lot of scholars believe that a lot of what we find in Genesis and in Exodus was largely influenced by the context of the writer's time, not the event's time. And so one of the things we'll see in the last one or two, I think we've got maybe one or two sessions left of this series, is some of the ideas that we find. For instance, the one we'll be dealing with today is the construction or the plan for the tabernacle. A lot of scholars believe that this was mainly influenced by the actual temple of Solomon, which was built much, much later, of course, than the story. And so this is a retrojection. It's taking the Temple of Solomon, which by this time is about to be completely demolished or has already been demolished, and writing that picture back into the tabernacle or the tent form that we find in Exodus, which is described as the tabernacle or the temple. What you're also going to find in, and once again, it's no longer surprising to me, is that the Temple of Solomon was not much different from any other temple in the surrounding areas. The Phoenician temples, for instance, they have the same structure. Many of those temples had 3 divisions. They had large seraphim type of figures on the outside. There's a lot of similarities, so much so that it seems quite obvious that Solomon's temple was most probably just an adaptation of the temples that were known to them during that time. Now, Solomon probably built in around, I don't know exactly, but I think it's about the 9th or 10th century BC. And so that happens first. And then 200-300 years later, during or after the destruction of that amazing temple, this story is written with that temple in mind. And so that throws things around a little bit, and it seems a little bit disjointed at first, but the more we encounter these type of things, the evidence seems to just kind of pile up to make what is probably happening here is a much later elite Israelite group writing a story back into history about the things that they are familiar with. All right, so what you might, the point I'm trying to make is that the Temple of Solomon was most probably not built on the template or the pattern of the old tabernacle, but that the tabernacle story was probably written after the Temple of Solomon and modeled on the Temple of Solomon. And it's this kind of back to front that takes a long time to get used to if you're a traditional Christian like me, or grew up in traditional Christianity like me, who just took the stories in the chronological order in which they placed them in our books. But it seems quite obvious now that unless you have a dogmatic idea about the Bible, in other words, ideas that cannot be proven with evidence but has to be believed on the tradition you've received, then it becomes very difficult to see it this way. But when we investigate the actual evidence, and actually the stuff that's in the Bible itself, it seems to become quite evident that we're really dealing with a reverse process here, a later period, taking their surroundings, for instance, the Tower of Babel, which would have been contemporary in Babylon with this 7th century, more or less 7th century Israelite people, and writing it back into their history book, or their Genesis story, which is what we found basically in Genesis, Exodus, these two very important and early books in the Bible. So let's move on today to the Book of the Covenant. Now, once they received the 10 Commandments at this Mount Sinai, there was also a bunch of laws that were given to Moses with regards to how to worship, how to govern this worship, how to govern the nation, and also, very importantly, laws for lifestyle. In other words, laws that told them how to treat slaves, how to treat their brothers and sisters, how to treat their children, how to treat their animals, how to treat the strangers. Now, all of these laws are written in preparation. According to the story, it's written in preparation for life in Canaan. So Canaan, or the Canaanites, it would have included a whole bunch of these guys, Amorites, Jebusites, etc., that lived in the land of Canaan, that were, according to the story, were serving pagan gods. And we today know a lot about Canaanitic religion because of the discoveries at Ugarit. We have a lot of insight on what the Canaanites actually believed. And this was a threat to the Israelites. And this kind of permeates the Old Testament. There's always this warning against falling for the gods of the Canaanites, or intermarrying with them so that your children would worship their gods. It was always a rivalry, a very strong rivalry between the Canaanites and the Israelites, specifically in terms of religion. Now, this is very interesting. I'm going a little bit off topic here, but I feel like I want to just mention this here. This is specifically interesting because a lot of the Old Testament spends its time on showing that Canaanite religion is false, that Canaanite religion is pagan, or, in our modern contemporary way of saying it, and that the Israelite way of serving Yahweh alone is the right way. A point that a lot of scholars make is that it wouldn't have been, the Bible would not have taken so much time in degrading and belittling Canaanite worship if it wasn't a real problem for the Israelites. It was written about because it was actually a real struggle in and during this time of the exile, or right before the exile, because of course the Israelites believe they went into exile exactly because they started serving and worshiping the Canaanite gods again, and that this was actually a major issue, and that's why it takes up so much space in the biblical history. Now, the interesting thing is, and we haven't touched on this at all, and I wasn't planning to touch on it, but I think it is worth mentioning, and for some of you this might be some new information. But as we've walked through Exodus, we've realized that we're not really dealing with strict history. At best, there's a kernel of history here that's been largely embellished, mythicized, written in cosmic language, in terms of the context of the elite writers of a much, much later time. Now, according to archaeology and what has been found in the archaeological record with regards to Canaanites and Israelites, many scholars, many of the best in the world, believe that Israelites were actually Canaanites. In other words, they don't believe that the Israelite people came out of Egypt. They believe that that's an origin story that was created later. They believe that the Israelites were actually Canaanites that started separating themselves from the Canaanites, that lived in the highlands more towards the east, while the Canaanites lived in the lowlands more towards the west, and that a new deity was accepted by the Israelites, Yahweh, as we all know, and that there was a religious rivalry between them. And that's the reason why a lot of the Bible spends its time fighting the Canaanite religion. There's many reasons why scholars say this. In other words, the point is that there wasn't a million Israelites coming out of Egypt to move into Israel for many reasons, which I don't really want to touch on right now. But the point is that they believe that Israel was kind of like a tribe from the Canaanites that separated over time. That at best, some scholars might say that a Moses type figure with a priestly group came from Egypt and introduced the new Yahweh worship, which we know come from the south. And that's what made them then this group become worshippers of Yahweh, where the Canaanites were worshippers of El and Baal, and they came up this rivalry. So this is kind of like what, as far as I understand, most secular scholars believe, that the Israelites are actually Canaanites, and that the Israelite religion is just an adaptation from Canaanite religion. Now that might sound blasphemous, I guess, or sacrilege to a lot of people. But I think the evidence is actually overwhelming. If you read the Ugaritic literature, I've spent a lot of time in it. If you have read about what we know archaeologically and historically from the literature that's left to us from the Ugaritic and the Canaanitic religion, you would realize that there is a very, very strong connection between Canaanite type of understanding of God and that of the Israelites. And there is an undeniable tie between these two religions. They kind of have the same structure. They have the same poetic writings about Baal as we have for Yahweh. And some scholars actually believe that some of the psalms that we have in our Bible were originally Baal psalms, that the name was basically changed. In Baal was a storm god, and so was Yahweh. There's a lot of things, and that's not the topic of this discussion. I just want to bring a little bit of scholarly, from what I know from the scholarly world, to give a little bit of context to the story of Exodus here and the entrance into Canaan, to understand that actually archaeologically and religiously, from what we know, Israelites were basically really Canaanites that lived within that area and started distinguishing themselves. We're not 100% sure how that happened, but that it did happen seems to be quite historically true. And we see the traces of that historicity in the Bible's aggression against the Canaanite religion, etc. Okay, so I just want to leave that at that. The reason why I'm bringing this up is that a lot of what we're about to encounter seems to be, to scholars, to be counter-Canaanitic polemic. In other words, for instance, we'll get to some of these examples, or actually I could just quickly mention it here. For instance, one of the instructions is that the Israelites are not supposed to make gods of silver and gold, as you might know, and they were supposed to build their altars when they arrive in Canaan with unchiseled stone and without steps. And I think the reason is so that your privates won't show as you ascend. And this is in Exodus 20, 23 to 26. Now, a lot of scholars believe that this is anti-Canaanitic propaganda or polemic, because the Canaanites, they built their altars of chiseled steps, of chiseled stone and with steps. And so this was in a direct opposition to Canaanitic writing. Okay, so some of these examples do pop up. The point is that the next 3 chapters, as we engage Exodus, lays out the laws that govern worship and govern the treatment of other people. Biblical scholars, So, for now, it's important to know that Canaan frames the section of laws, because living obediently in Canaan is what these laws are for. Now, from the point of someone writing this much later, during or after the exile, or before even, or during or after the exile, um, the Israelites believed that God had thrown them out of the promised land because of their idol worship. And so when they are busy writing this, regurgitating this, putting it into writing form, they are writing it so that future generations will not make the same mistake. And so it's in some way it's a letter of encouragement, a letter of admonition against the idol worship that caused the exile in the first place. All right. So this fact alone, that some of these laws are written in response or in reaction to Canaanitic life, should tell us that these laws were not meant to be set in stone for all people, for all ages. That's a very important point. And I think that although many of us as Christians, we would mentally say, yes, all of the Bible is, we quote the New Testament that says all of Scripture is used as God breathed and it's used for admonition and correction and instruction. But when we come to these type of ancient laws, it's very clear that these laws weren't written for us. In other words, we can't just copy them out of a 7th century BC text context and paste them into 2025. Altars are, to some degree, completely irrelevant to us. We've spiritualized everything. And so it's important to know this, that not everything that's found in the Bible is supposed to be copy-pasted into your life. There is a process of contextualizing it in its original context, then transporting it into today, and then recontextualizing. And that's actually kind of what theology is making sense of ancient things which seem to be irrelevant, and to give them some sense of relevance for today. Obviously, not all the laws in Exodus are necessarily completely irrelevant for us, but it seems like some definitely are. We can go on and on about this. For instance, the laws about slavery, which we'll talk about in a moment, seem to be completely irrelevant for today. In fact, they contradict the moral compass that most of us moderns today have. Ideas about not eating bacon, etc., etc. Most normal Christians would say, no, that's not for us. And so we just need to understand what we're doing in that moment. We are recognizing that not all of Scripture is supposed to teach us how to exactly live. It's not how it works. We need to be careful how we handle Scripture before we put ourselves back into primitive times. All right. So biblical laws have ancient context, and that's why it takes time to figure them out and to see to what extent God is actually speaking to us through them when we're reading the Word, right? We have to connect ourselves to the ancient context, and that's a very, very difficult task. But at least by engaging this type of process, even just watching these videos, you kind of have engaged that process, being serious about what is actually written down. How it is actually understood, not by our church or by our apologists, but by people who study the text for what it is, and how to then bring this across, right? So beginning with Exodus 21:1 and running through to Exodus 23:19, we see a range of regulations, and they deal with social and religious matters. And we're just going to concern ourselves here with some of the highlights, right? A striking feature of the Book of the Covenant is that it presents these social and religious regulations in kind of like a back and forth pattern. It doesn't separate them at all. Religious life and the social life seems to be intertwined completely for the Israelites, and so are the regulations that govern them. They intermingle, they're not separated. A small snapshot of how this actually plays out is in Exodus 23:12-14, where the religious regulation of keeping the Sabbath has an immediate social implication, so that the slaves and the resident aliens can rest. We have mentioned this previously, but you can see how the religious actions have a direct impact on the social concerns. So some of these things, some other things to take note of is that some of these laws kind of conflict with later biblical laws. Now, you might, I think as a fundamental type of Christian, does not seem to be a possible scenario. Like nothing in the Bible can actually contradict itself, but it just seems to be true that things in the Bible do contradict each other. And this is one of the examples, one of the many examples, is how the laws written down in Exodus changed over time as they are later recorded in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. This seems to be a rather obvious example. It also worries us when we see this, because we realize that these laws were not hard-pressed, boxed perfectly for each generation, and that therefore it stands to reason that these laws come to us through the filter of human agency. And as humans progress or human situation changes, so the laws take on a different form. And that's just one of the things we need to realize, that this is actually how the Bible works, right? It's not a book that fell from God that has to be obeyed by the letter. If you obeyed the Bible by the letter, you'd be in jail by now. And most of us don't. All right. So some of these biblical laws, they kind of evolve or they change over time. As we saw, for instance, with the Sabbath commands, laws in the Book of the Covenant do not always line up with the other biblical laws in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. So two examples from this is, number one, according to Exodus, you can find this in 21:11, verse 2, 21:2 to 11. Hebrew male slaves can be freed after 7 years, but the female slaves cannot. Right? In Deuteronomy 15:12 to 18, both male and female slaves may gain their freedom. And in Leviticus 25:39 to 43, it is forbidden to even have a Hebrew slave. So this is a clear progression from a more primitive view on slavery to a more progressive view on slavery, and we find it within the Bible itself. Second example, Exodus 22 verse 33 and Deuteronomy 14 verse 21. They prohibit all Israelites from eating the carcass of any animal they happen to cross. So if the thing is dead and it's lying in the ground, you can't eat the carcass, you can't touch it. But in Leviticus 11:33 to 40, 17 verse 15 and 22 verse 8 requires the priest, because the priests are required to have a high level of holiness than in Exodus and Deuteronomy. Only the priests are forbidden to eat the roadkill. So we see a development. Obviously, it's blatantly obvious that we're dealing with different traditions that have been put together by later scribes. Right, so in the Book of the Covenant, there's 3 major festivals. And these festivals themselves have histories, and I'll mention just something about their history, which I can't prove here, but it seems to be quite logical and seems like it's quite probable, some of the ideas that I'll put before you today. There are 3 annual festivals that the Israelites have to celebrate: the festival of unleavened bread, of harvest, and the ingathering. This we found in Exodus 23, verse 14 to 17. Now, the festival of unleavened bread is tied to the Passover, chapter 12, verse 13 to 15. But normally in the Old Testament, it isn't. They put separate. But in Exodus, they put together. It seems like it's one festival. Scholars normally believe that the unattached versions, in other words, the places where unleavened bread and the Passover is as 2 separate festivals, is an older version of the tradition. And the one in Exodus is the newer one, where it's kind of brought together, simplified for the people. The harvest festival is also called the festival of first fruit or the festival of weeks in other places of the Old Testament. It is associated with the yearly grain harvest. During the time of Jesus, the Greek-speaking Jews, they called this festival Pentecost. The festival of ingathering is called also the festival of booths or festival of tabernacles, and is probably named originally after the temporary shelters that were erected while gathering in the harvest. Only later did it become to be associated with Israel's nomadic existence in the 40-year wandering wilderness. So once again here we have a situation where if you read it, if we place it in the back to front where I explained a bit earlier, we actually have the Israelites already doing this, going into little booths, having the Feast of Tabernacles, but then writing it, the reason for it, they write it into the Exodus. The 40-year wandering and so on. And it seems like a bit of a back to front situation. In other words, they're writing, it's not exactly the same, but it's like the myth writing that storytellers have done for millennia. We find a snake, it has no legs. We create a story to tell our children why snakes have no legs. So we have one day the snake went there and he was walking on his legs and he was teasing a crocodile and the crocodile bit his legs off. And that's why we have snakes without legs. It's stories that help make sense of the way the world is. And I think scholars view some of these things in Exodus like this. This was already the case inside of Israelite life. And the Exodus story is their way of making sense of why we have this festival every year. It seems to be, I wouldn't say that's true for everything, but there seems to be definite elements of this in the motivation behind the writing of Exodus. So without opening a huge can of worms, these feasts, some, all, probably were adapted from older Canaanite practices. So here is what I mentioned a little bit earlier, is this thing that rears its head in the historical study of Israel, and you can go study it for yourself, that they were probably Canaanites, and that a lot of these festivals were actually Canaanite festivals that were adapted as the Israelites parted with the Canaanites. Obviously, some of these festivals stayed, but they had to find new reasons for these festivals. They found new origin stories for these festivals. Okay. The idea that religions adapt older traditions and then modify them for their own sake is not new. Christianity has done that. We put the December date on the 25th of December. It is an adaptation from older religious ideas. I've got nothing against Christmas. I have a Christmas tree in my home. We celebrate Christmas, whatever. But the point is just Christianity is also, we have religions in general adapt older traditions for themselves. And it seems like a lot of what the Israelites have, the ideas about God, the anthropomorphic view of God, the attributes of God, some of the feasts, their way of doing things seems to be just an adaptation of older Canaanite ways. For instance, the idea, and this is not, we don't not deal with in Exodus, but I just want to mention this, like the idea of the scapegoat, sending a innocent goat, put all the sins on him and send him out into the wilderness. These are not new ideas. They weren't invented by the Israelites. As far as I know, that type of idea was already present in the Hittite world. The idea of tithes are not new to the Israelites. These are adapted ideas from ancient societies, religious societies, that they basically the Israelites adapted. And it seems like the feasts follow the same type of pattern. Okay. So the Book of the Covenant, of course, includes one of the most quoted laws, which is life for a life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And for those of you who don't know, it actually goes further in here in the Old Testament, in Exodus. Hand for a hand, foot for a foot, burn for a burn, wound for a wound, and stripe for a stripe. Obviously not invented by the Israelites. The law code of King Hammurabi of Babylon had something very similar, and it wasn't... the point of the law was to reduce vengeance and to at least limit recompense in ancient societies. Okay, then there's two things I would like to highlight here that makes things a little bit uneasy, especially for people who believe that these laws are eternal, that they were given directly from God, and that they can't evolve. They're not allowed to evolve, and this is exactly what God wants for the earth. And then you end up with some real moral problems here in Exodus. Two examples of this is the idea of slavery, and secondly, the treatment of the daughters of fathers. So we know ancient patriarchal societies that women, daughters, were more like property than anything else, and it was highly misogynistic, and some of this stuff is reflected in the Bible. And this is one of the reasons why we know, and we can say with high probability, that the Bible is a reflection of its time. And it is not a timeless truth in that sense, but it's a reflection of its time, and it must be allowed to change. In other words, the Bible is a part of a trajectory, and it's not a box that we got to push modern humanity back into. All right, so the first idea is slavery. Of course, today, the idea of slavery, what is slavery? Slavery is when a person owns another person. You buy them like you buy a car or a plant, and you own them, and you can do with them what you like. And I mean, the bad part about this is that in the ancient times, and unfortunately, there's still some societies on earth where when you have a slave girl, although you believe it's morally wrong to commit adultery, with a slave girl, you can have sex whenever you want because that's your slave girl, that's your property. I know for a fact that some fundamental Muslim societies still believe this. It's terrible. But I also know that in the ancient Israelite world, the ancient Canaanite world, the ancient Iron Age world, this was kind of standard practice. Like owning a slave meant that you could do with him whatever you want. Now, unfortunately, it seems like the book of the law, includes instructions on how slaves were to be treated and what you were supposed to do with them and when you could set them free. And unfortunately, these law codes don't, what I would have expected from the Bible is here for God to say, hey, no more slaves. I'm against slavery. I'm against humans owning other humans. And I don't want you to have any slaves. And I don't want you to take any slaves. But this is not what the Bible does. The Bible fully endorses slavery, the Old Testament at least. It endorses it fully. It gives command on how to take slaves. With the taking of some of the cities in Canaan, they were told to take the women as slaves and the children. So, yeah, we can argue about, it's this type of slavery or it's that type of slavery, or they could work for their freedom. It's all really irrelevant to the point that slavery is completely amoral. We won't allow it in our modern day societies because it's against everything inside of us. And it's slightly tragic that a book that we revere as the actual words of God, the way that many Christians see it, endorses it fully. So we really have two choices here. We can either understand that God is for slavery, or we can understand that this book comes to us through human agency, and that although in some way inspired, it came out the way it shouldn't be. It shouldn't have come out like this. But anyway, fine. So the thing is that for slaves, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth didn't work. Since they were considered property, you can read Exodus 21, Exodus 26, Exodus 21, verse 20 and 26 to 27. And this is really one of the moral problems that we see in the Book of the Covenant. One that Christians have had to contend with for a very long time. Does God endorse slavery is really the question. The owning of one person by another, because God certainly does here. And he gives laws to his people on how to deal with this. To suggest that God evolves himself and changes over time, I think would be a ridiculous notion, or at least a fringe idea. So you need to make sense of this the way you do. The way I make sense of this is these laws are given by Moses and not by God. It's pretty simple. Okay. Now, this should be a great lesson for us Christians. Our theology and our thinking about God can never rest fully just on scripture verses. And in fact, actually, this is hard to understand, but it never really has. Theology has always been more than the cutting and pasting of scriptures into our lives. There's always been a process of theologizing the scriptures and reinterpreting them. In fact, you maybe you already have ideas in your mind on why this is okay, and you rationalize it for yourself. That's what we do. It's been about building a discerning connection about ancient and modern times. For example, the doctrine of the Trinity, we can't really find in the New Testament. It's something that develops later based on some scriptures in the New Testament, but it comes quite a lot later, right? We theologize the scriptures. We don't copy-paste the scriptures. If we did, I could give you hundreds of examples of why Christians don't follow the words of Jesus, but their own interpretation of the words of Jesus. It's once you become aware of it, it keeps on slapping you in the face. So that's slavery. The second one is the idea of virgin daughters. The idea of virgin daughters here seems to be also the idea that they are property of their father, right? Exodus 22:16. And if a man comes and seduces your virgin daughter, he has to marry her and he has to pay for her. And he has to pay the father. So why would another person have to pay for taking your daughter unless she is considered some sort of asset or property? It's really strange. She, of course, has absolutely no say in the matter. She's kind of like a property that gets sold off. And even if the guy that seduces her has sex with her and leaves her as a non-virgin, even if he doesn't want to marry her, he still has to pay you because she's become damaged goods. In other words, the father won't get a great price for her when he then gets her to marry later. And it's actually, this is terrible, because part of what this does is tells women today that if they have sexual intercourse before they get married, that they are damaged goods. And that is, it's terrible. Anyway, so now, the law that goes right before this law, which is rather interesting because it creates context, is the one that mandates restitution payment, right, for an owner whose neighbor borrows one of his animals and it is injured or dies. So right before you have the one on daughters who are damaged that need to be paid for, you have the one for animals that are damaged that need to be paid for. And some Bible versions, think about this clearly, some Bible interpretations or translations, they separate these two verses and put a heading in between. Now, we all know by now, for goodness sake, that headings are the inventions of later translators. In the original, these things were together. But it seems like translators were trying to create a classification difference or a category shift between these two verses. But in the original, this is all part of the same. Now, this makes perfect sense if you understand ancient peoples, because that's how things happened. Women, daughters were kind of property of their fathers. This truly is an embarrassing moment for the Bible, one that is very hard to work with today, right? This distinction that some translations want to make between the animals and the daughter by creating like a little gap there is completely artificial. The father gets paid because his daughter has been damaged, in the same way that he gets paid if his animals are damaged. This could be a difficult read for women today. We all wish that God had simply said, oh yes, and virgin daughters are no one's property. They are not damaged goods when they are seduced. But in reality, we get this from the ancient text. But it fits well in the ancient context, without regards for our modern conceptions. All right. So that's a quick summary of the laws and what we found in there. Now, let's spend a couple of moments, the next 7 minutes, on looking a little bit forward and talking about the entrance into Canaan. Earlier, we mentioned that the Book of the Covenant is framed by passages that have a Canaanite feel to them, where the conquest of Canaan is previewed. An angel is going to guide the Israelites into Canaan. His voice must be obeyed, otherwise there's punishment. Like blessings and curses that's mentioned in 23:20-22. We have already seen the angel of the Lord in the burning bush. We've seen it at the Sea of Reeds. And perhaps this is the same angel. I could say so much about angels in the Old Testament, and angels don't have names this early on. That's a later apocalyptic Jewish development. There's one angel, there's just the angel of the Lord, which seems to be a representation and almost in some cases a type of a manifestation of God himself. There's no archangels. So anyway, we have this. We don't know if it's the same one. It doesn't say. But we also just don't know why he's there in the first place. More to the point, the passage in Exodus does not describe the conquest of Canaan as a military bloodbath bordering on genocide, as we find in Deuteronomy 20 and the first half of the book of Joshua, right? But here in Exodus, it seems more like a gradual process, and a process where the angel goes in front of them, drives the Canaanites out, and then the Israelites just have to come and do the remnant work, right? The angel does not blot out the Canaanites. Excuse me, the angel does blot out. Exodus 23:23, the Canaanites. But this word typically means to hide or to cut off. The idols are demolished, of course, but the Canaanites, which is a generic name for the inhabitants, which includes Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, did I say Hittites? Yeah, Hivites and Jebusites. They are thrown into confusion by the terror of God in front of the Israelites. This terror seems to be a type of a pestilence. Of course, this is a very normative way of understanding the workings of the gods in this time. Pestilence was seen as the hand or the acts of the gods. And the Israelites will only be responsible for then finally driving them out. The process also is said to happen little by little. While the Israelites move in, they take over so that they won't upset the agricultural balance in the land. The gradual invasion seemed to be more like what has happened is described in Judges 1:1 to 2 verse 5 than what is described in Joshua. Notice the point is Joshua, if you read Joshua just plain, it seems like a massive genocide, like kill everything. Where in here it seems to be much more the angel of the Lord's going to put terror on them, they're going to flee, and you just have to just do the final driving out. It's going to happen little by little. It seems like it's two different versions, to be honest. It seems just like the Old Testament contains more than one version of how the Israelites came to possess the land of Canaan. Now, archaeologically, the archaeological records seem to corroborate that there wasn't one massive invasion and a quick slaughtering of nations and cities, and the archaeological record doesn't really have that. And therefore, it's one of the reasons why a lot of scholars believe that there was no real invasion of Canaanites by 1 million Israelites coming out of Egypt and through the wilderness. It was more infighting between two tribes in the exact same land. And this story you're reading in Exodus, Judges, and in Deuteronomy is a largely magnified and embellished version of how the Israelites became a separate entity within Canaan. Right. The section ends in chapter 24, 1 to 8, where Moses reads from the book of the covenant, the words of the Lord that has been written down. The people respond with a resounding pledge of allegiance. Moses then erects 12 pillars representing the tribes of Israel and an altar, and he makes the entire occasion with sacrifices and the sprinkling of blood. Nothing new for ancient people. That sprinkling binds the people to God. It's like a blood covenant, if you want to call it something. And it's also hard to read this without thinking immediately of the sacrifice of the Passover lamb and the blood sprinkled, smeared on the doorposts. It seems to ring in the same direction. The Israelites have basically now signed the dotted line, willing to enter into the agreement with Yahweh. The next step on the journey is to build now the portable sanctuary. So there's one thing missing now from this experience at Sinai. They have the laws, they have the Ten Commandments, they have laws that will govern their treating of others and their worship engagements. Now what is needed, because Sinai, the mountain, obviously can't move, they're going to put God into a tabernacle, and that will be the way in which the God Yahweh is going to move with them into Canaan. Right, so this portable sanctuary is what we call the tabernacle, and I've said a bit about it. The Book of the Covenant, of course, in the hand, and so with the Book of the Covenant in the hand, and the building of the sanctuary is about to begin, Israel is in full training mode, ready for entering Canaan as obedient and faithful worshippers, or at least that is the plan. We're going to end here today, and we'll come back to, and I think we are very close to finishing here. Let me have a quick look. I think we have one or two more sessions, and then we'll be ending this series on Exodus. Thanks for joining me today. I made a lot of statements today that I didn't provide a lot of evidence for. The statements, I don't suck them out of my thumb. I've done extensive reading by very reputable scholars, multiple books on the issues, archaeological evidence for these type of situations, the reading of the Ugaritic literature in conjunction with the Old Testament. So I just want you to know that I'm not making stuff up here. These are things that scholars are obviously still debating to some degree, but a lot of these things are kind of consensus amongst the critical scholars. Thanks so much for watching today. Have a great day. Cheers.